Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen. Let's take a trip through time and across space to Tangier. If you see her, say hello. She might be in Tangier. She left here last early spring. Is living there, I hear. So sang Bob Dylan in 1975. The Moroccan city of Tangier was a magnet for artists, writers, musicians and political exiles throughout the mid-20th century. From 1924 to 1956, it operated as the Tangier International Zone under the joint administration of several European powers. And this status created an environment of legal ambiguity which, combined with the city's location at the crossroads of Africa and Europe, made it a haven for those seeking to escape from the constraints of conventional society. The zone had a sense of lawlessness and freedom, attracting a diverse mix of expats, spies, smugglers and avant-garde intellectuals. And the city's permissive attitude towards drugs, homosexuality and radical political thought made it a particularly alluring destination for members of the counterculture. Influenced by the composer and writer and long-term resident Paul Bowles, members of the Beat generation came to the city to be inspired and to live the Moroccan dream. One of the most significant was the American writer William Burroughs, whose time there in the 50s deeply influenced his novel Naked Lunch. Although the Tangier International Zone officially ceased to exist in 1956, its myth lives on in literature, music, and perhaps in reality. And we're going to hear about it today from my guest. But before we do, I'd like to invite you to join us at the ambiguous zone called the Bureau of Lost Culture, www.bureauoflostculture.com, where all our countercultural stories are held. And thanks to Chris, Ali, Paul, Bob and Dean for contacting me recently with suggestions and appreciation. We'd love to hear from friends. Abdul Aziz Taleb is a multimedia artist and director of the Arab Media Lab project. He's taken a very deep dive into the Interzone, both the reality and the myth, and explored the blurred line between them. We're going to talk about all that, and we're going to hear from Bowles and Burroughs, touch upon the legacy and mystery of Tangier, and hear something about the Moroccan perspective on these bohemian outsiders who came to experience freedom from their own societies and saw the city as a sort of lab for artistic experiment, but perhaps without much regard for the locals, some of whom, as we'll hear, were actually an inspiration for the beats themselves. I'm very pleased to welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture my guest today, Abdul Aziz Taleb. Hello, Aziz.
Hello, how are you doing?
We're doing pretty good. Now, you are in Germany. We're going to talk about your home country, Morocco, but before we do that, why don't you tell us a little bit about Aziz?
Well, I was born in Agadir, Morocco. It's a small city, in the southern of Morocco. And I was always fascinated by the art of moving images. I was always like going to the cinema while I was very, very young, watching B movies, and I grew up loving movies. And then when I grew up, I started to do video art with the VHS, if you remember, VHS.
I remember VHS. I remember it. Yep.
So when I was trying to experiment with what's happening around me, I couldn't afford to have a 16 millimeter or there was no DV cameras at the time, nothing. So I had to I had to go to the university, to ask them for VHS cameras to allow me to experiment, And I'm a mixed media artist, filmmaker, curator, and also I'm the director of the Arab Media Lab project.
Yeah, tell us about the Arab Media Lab project. What is that?
Yeah, it's a mixed media art space in Marrakesh where we curate like film program. We lead workshops for the local people who don't have access to the medium, and workshops and also trainings and master classes. We invite also artists from abroad, to lead like some kind of workshops there. And also we produce films.
And talking about experimenting, talk about being an artist and a multimedia artist and cutting up tape. That rather neatly brings us to William Burroughs. And obviously most people know Burroughs was, and maybe have read Naked Lunch. And Naked Lunch was written by Burroughs in Tangier. And we're going to talk about Tangier as is and why it became a haven, possibly even a sanctuary for artists, bohemians, and several members of the Beat generation. Before we dig into that particular time in the 40s and 50s, let's just backtrack a bit, because Tangier is in Morocco. It's the gateway to the Mediterranean. But this thing called the Tangier International Zone started in 1924. Can you tell us why?
It was like governed by different countries. It didn't belong to Morocco at the time. The British had their own rules there, Spanish, and also I think French also. So that's why it was an international zone actually. While Morocco was under
colonial rule, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it was like an international zone where everybody can come and try to play with the rules, gangsters, politicians, writers, artists. So it was kind of a melting point, a kind of a unique cultural crossroads, actually. Tangier was always like kind of a mysterious place, Tangier itself as a physical space, it was kind of always mysterious to a lot of people. And if you go back to Delacroix, for instance, Delacroix was a French painter who came to Tangier, I think, a long time ago. If you analyze his paintings, it's always a still painting, It's like, for him, it's like the time stops somewhere in it. And maybe that's why also a lot of artists, in the 50s and of course, they were like escaping from the social and political environment that was dominating in the West, looking maybe for some kind of the Moroccan dream also, For them, time stops there. And the Interzone concept, both like literal and metaphorical space, it captures this Tanger's identity as a place where cultures, ideas, often collided, So it's something, that somehow we can explain if we dive into history, but at the same time, you cannot really explain into one or two sentences.
There is some mystery about Tangier, and I think that because it was administered by different European powers at the time, and there was a lot of confusion about what was legal, what was not legal, what was allowed, what was not allowed, and who's going to prosecute it, which created this sort of ambiguous place. The sort of mystery of Tangier as well, and this kind of cultural depth, possibly to do with its location. I mean, it's at the crossroads of Africa and Europe. It's at the entrance to the Mediterranean. So you imagine that, for literally thousands of years, it had been a significant place where different people, different cultures were combining, possibly clashing sometimes.
What you said is very interesting. I mean, if you go to Tangier, you still feel this energy of a melting point. A lot of energies, which is like strange but also beautiful.
Yeah.
From my point of view as an artist, this is how I see it. I see like the reality and the dream, this thin line between the reality and dream, which is Interzone, actually.
Yes.
And I think a lot of historians try to understand what you just described, which is really true. But in the end, nobody came up with the truth.
The historical reality of Tangier meets the dream of Tangier. That's something which you experienced too and still experience, rather than some colonial fantasy. In the West, in America and Britain, maybe there's been a fantasy about places like Tangier, some of which was maybe based on truth and some of it not. Something mysterious, something which was very attractive in a different way to Anglo-Saxon culture.
Yeah, but listen, maybe it was made also or like portrayed as a mystery because that's how the West wanted it to be. If you read the book Orientalism by Edward Said, there was always some kind of cliches, stereotypes, and how the West wanted to portray a region and wanted to be not moving, to stay still,
Yeah.
in within the people, the culture, and space.
The other thing which this strange legal ambiguity with all these different powers involved allowed is that there was no censorship, which allowed radical political ideas and radical people, actually, in controversial literature to flourish there, right? But the other thing which is kind of fascinating is that because it had these sort of lax financial regulations, it became a kind of tax haven and attracting expats and businessmen and smugglers and illicit traders. It had this black market, right, where it was easy to acquire smuggled goods, including banned books, narcotics, right? I mean, that also would have been an attraction for some people, right? Particularly people like Burroughs, who's a junkie.
Yeah, of course, of course. But that's one of the main things why they came also, to have this kind of freedom somehow.
Freedom, yeah, yeah. Also, particularly in the Second World War and in the Cold War afterwards, it became a kind of meeting place for espionage, right, and spies.
That's what I heard. That was Tangier. There were a lot of things for espionage. There were a lot of gangsters also who came from the US. One of them is very known, Lucky Marciano. Everybody was coming to Tangier, to escape from something or trying to leave something, to experience some kind of freedom.
Whether it be freedom from kind of moral restrictions about,
Yeah.
say, sex and drugs, or from financial restrictions about how you could do business.
Yeah.
And of course, that image, which of course is in the film Casablanca in the Second World War, Casablanca is different than Tangier, but it kind of captures that somehow, this crossroads of where you've got spies and smugglers, gangsters, as you say, all kind of mixing at the same time, along with, of course, the locals.
Exactly.
That's the background to what we're going to talk about, this extraordinary historical, cultural anomaly and also geographical significance. But Paul Bowles comes to Tangier in the late 1930s, and he is the person who sort of opened the door for the subsequent generation of artists and writers. Here is a sidebar about Paul Bowles. Paul Bowles was an American expat composer and writer and one of the most influential figures to make Tangier his home. He arrived in Morocco in the late 30s and he found himself captivated by the country's landscape, culture and people. He settled there permanently in Tangier in 1947. In 1949 he published his most famous novel, The Sheltering Sky, influenced by his experiences in North Africa. Bowles had a complex relationship with his sexuality. Whilst he was married to Jane, a talented writer, their marriage was unconventional and largely platonic. Both pursued same-sex relationships, and Tangier provided them with a space where such relationships could be conducted with much less scrutiny than in the US or Europe. For Bowles, Tangier's openness allowed him to engage in relationships with young Moroccan men. However, his interactions with local men also reflected the power imbalance of the time. Wealthy Western expats who had access to economic and social privilege that gave them influence over their Moroccan lovers. Beyond his own writing, Bowles played a crucial role, as we'll hear, in introducing Moroccan oral traditions to the West, making extensive field recordings of Moroccan music and translating Moroccan literature, particularly the works of Mohammed Shukri. He was idolised by writers of the Beat generation, many of whom visited Bowles and his wife Jane in Tangier.
I did not choose to live in Tangier permanently. It happened. My visit was meant to be of short duration. After that, I would move on. I grew lazy and put off debauchees. After that, when I went somewhere else, I immediately longed to be back in Tangier. It has been touched by fewer of the negative aspects of contemporary civilization and most cities of its size. More important than that, I relish the idea that in the night, all around me in my sleep, sorcery is burrowing its invisible tunnels in every direction, from thousands of senders to thousands of unsuspecting recipients. Spells are being cast, poison is running its course. Souls are being dispossessed of parasitic pseudo-consciousnesses that lurk in the unguarded resources of the mind. There is drumming out there most nights. It never awakens me. I hear the drums and incorporate them into my dream, like the nightly cries of the muezzins. Even if, in the dream, I'm in New York, the first Allah Akbar effaces the backdrop and carries whatever comes next to North Africa, and the dream goes on.
I always say that Paul Boyce, he liked Morocco, but he never liked the Moroccans. He only liked his own interpretation of Morocco, but at the same time, it attracts the others, to experience the same thing. Paul Boyce was the first to come as a writer there. I don't know, maybe there was some people before him, but Paul Boyce, it was him who introduced, opened the doors to his friends, and I don't know what kind of ideas he was telling them, but for them it was a kind of a Moroccan dream,
So his translations of Mohammed Shukri's work did bring attention to them, didn't he? As well as using the country or using Tangier for inspiration for his own works, he did value Moroccan literature and Moroccan music, as you said, as well, because he made these field recordings of Moroccan traditional music.
I've always been interested in recording Moroccan music. In 1959, I got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. So I decided to start work. The authorities were not in accord. Many of them, they didn't like the idea of Moroccan music being recorded at all. If you record music in that village, it's going to sound like savages. I said, no, not at all. It's very good music. No. That was the idea that people had about their own country. For me, it was simply a pleasure to record things that I knew would not be available for long. I saved quite a lot of wonderful music from oblivion.
I'm not a big fan of Paul Boyce, to be honest, but I really respect him and I admire his work, First of all, by archiving the traditional Moroccan music. He introduced the Jajouka music to the rest of the world, actually. He contributes a lot to make Moroccan artists also known. But there was some kind of hate and love relation between him and the Moroccan writers and the storytellers, So it was not always a love story, It's
كيقول له تزيد كيقول لي لا نو ديال لا بحالنا الشاب كيجلس له على رجلو ديك الطير كيطير.
In the early 1950s, I used to go every morning with Yacoubi to a part of the beach far out where nobody ever came. And I have a notebook with me, and we would lie in the sun, and Yacoubi recounted stories. They were generally very funny. Well, he was particularly good after he'd had smoked keef, and the stories were funnier. As he spoke, I would translate them into English as fast as I could. And I enjoyed doing that. Jane was ill, so I gave up trying to write, but I did want to work every day, so I worked on these translations. And then I met Mohammed Mrabat, and he began telling stories. They weren't meant to be funny, and they weren't meant to be true either. They were inventions.
حتى وصلوا لواحد الجبل جا في وسط البحر وقف عليه قال له هود راه هما كيتسناوك من تحت. الشاب هول ديك الجبال وجبر واحد الشيباني واقف وقنصو وقعد عملوا له ياتاي شرب اتاي. واحد البنت هي اللي مقابلهم. الولد بدا كيشوف ديك البنت والبنت كتشوف فيه. جا الشيباني قال للولد عجباتك البنت؟ قال له ياه محسونة. وسول البنت قال لها بنتي عجبك الولد؟ قالت له ياه دابا.
I mean, in terms of Jajouka music, and people may be aware that Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones came to Morocco in later decades, to record with Jajouka musicians.
Maybe Paul Boyce introduced Mohammed Hamri to him. It was Mohammed Hamri, is a very famous Moroccan painter, and also he's one of the founders, I can say, of the beat generation in Tangier, because he was a friend of Brian Gyson. They had a kind of place where people meet, listen to music. It was a restaurant, actually. It was called 1001 Nights. He's a Moroccan art painter and also musician, and it was him who introduced Jajouka music to Brian Gyson.
Mhm.
Brian Gyson introduced Mohammed Hamri and Jajouka music to Brian Jones. That's why Brian Jones came down to Tangier and recorded his album, The Pipes of Pana Jajouka, the famous one. If you look at the cover of his of the album, it was a painting from Mohammed Hamri, actually.
Do you feel that he has not actually been given sufficient credit or attention as one of the beats because he's Moroccan?
Yeah, by the Western journalists or media or the Western narrative. But he was given credits by the people who were around him at the time, like Brian Jones, on Gyson, even Paul Boyce. Mohammed Hamri was the big guy in Tangier at the time. So for me, personally, I think it's because of him and Brian Gyson that the beat generation was founded in Tangier. In my opinion, again, not in a hotel in Paris called the Beat Hotel. If it was not these two guys, yeah, we won't discover the technique of cut-up afterwards. The cut-up, I think, in my opinion, it was inspired from the Jajouka music, actually.
Hamri and Gyson, in a way, were the axis which made this whole thing spin. Gyson is quite often undercredited for the invention of the cut-up. It's usually, people think much more about Burroughs, but in fact it was Gyson who came up with the cut-up idea, wasn't it? Yeah. And so you think that Gyson's was influenced to do that by the Jajouka music. Why? What is it about that music that might have caused that spark of inspiration?
If you listen to Jajouka music, it's also this non-conventional rhythm. It's some kind of cut-ups. You don't know what's coming. You don't know where are you going, and sometimes you don't even know what you are hearing. Same like the technique, you cut things here and there, and then you assemble them, and then you make some kind of interesting works. It's experimentation.
Experimentation, improvisation, right?
Yeah, improvisation. Yeah.
Not concerned with linear narratives, whether it be in the music in terms of the melodies and
intuition, and if you analyze the Moroccan culture, and it's always about intuition. It's not planning, it's always intuition. You can hear it in music, you can see it in the way people interact, the way people, maybe now it's different, but that's how it was back then.
So you think there's something fundamental, or there was something fundamental in Moroccan culture which gets expressed in Jajouka, but in other ways too?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about the Moroccans at that time, to return briefly to Paul Bowles. One of the things which created this imbalance, of course, is that you've got, by Moroccan standards, a very wealthy person, an expatriate who's got certain interests, whether they be in sexuality or drugs. You've got an imbalance, haven't you, with the locals and how a person like that would interact with them, and also a big age gap. I mean, young men. Tangier offered him the luxury of being able to take advantage of that, but at the same time, there is something concerning about it, because he may have been a bohemian, but he maintained the colonial power imbalance. You've got access to economic privilege, and then you've got local youth who are, often from an impoverished background, right?
That's what a lot of people say. And also, he was also a businessman. He was earning money from translating and helping, the young Moroccan writers also to publish their own stories. If you really look at the books of Muhammad Murabit, for instance, I think Muhammad Murabit, he published more than than Paul Boys himself, which of course, were translated by Paul Boys himself. But he was making money out of that.
In your research, Aziz, did you come across how the locals regarded Paul Bowles, or later on Burroughs, or any of the others, about their interactions with these Westerners, what it was like from their side?
I found some, of course, but they don't dig really, really deep into things, which I can also understand, because some of the Moroccan writers like Muhammad al-Marab still alive. From our culture and our perspective, we don't like to talk about some details, It's understood, but I never saw a film program or even a study about the Moroccan contribution into the movement, the Beat Generation in Tangier.
So Bowles basically, because he's there, he's communicating back with America, he's getting published in America, he's creating this very attractive for some people image of Tangier and Morocco, and then starts to draw in other people. Here is another sidebar about William Burroughs in the Interzone. Burroughs' Naked Lunch, one of the most infamous and influential novels of the 20th century, known for its disjointed, hallucinatory style and its shocking, often grotesque imagery, was largely written while Burroughs lived in Tangier in the 50s. Burroughs had arrived there in 1954, fleeing legal troubles in the US following the accidental, completely irresponsible shooting of his wife, Joan Vollmer, in Mexico. Tangier's international atmosphere, lawlessness and exotic culture provided the perfect backdrop for Burroughs' surreal exploration of addiction, control, and the grotesque underbelly of human existence. His chaotic blend of cultures, languages, and ambiguities mirrored the fragmented and anarchic nature of Naked Lunch, a book that resists traditional narrative structure. Burroughs was deeply addicted to heroin and using other drugs during his time in Tangier, and his experiences with addiction are central to Naked Lunch. The novel is a relentless descent into the mind of an addict, with shifting settings that range from the grotesque Interzone, a nightmarish, fictionalized version of Tangier, to various dystopian landscapes populated by sinister government agents, depraved doctors, and monstrous creatures. Interzone serves as a kind of surreal counterpart to Tangier, blending real-life elements of the city with Burroughs' fevered imagination. As we've heard, Tangier was a meeting place for the Beat Generation, and Burroughs was visited there by Allen Ginsberg and Kerouac, who helped him compile and edit Naked Lunch for publication. Burroughs arrives in 1954. It's quite interesting with Burroughs because he was there for about 4 years in Tangier, and he was escaping. I mean, he'd had these legal troubles in the US. Again, Tangier would have seemed attractive because he could fully indulge his heroin habit whilst writing, and his time in Tangier was very inspiring for him, wasn't it?
It is. I think he liked it to be there, but at the same time, if you listen to what people say, who lived with him, especially from the Moroccan perspective, he was always like kind of suspicious about everything. He was not really open to anybody or to anything. He was there trying to feel the place and get inspired, but he was always a lone guy, even with his Western friends. He was like kind of the man who wasn't there.
Could I ask this question of Bill Burroughs? What is that led you? This is a tough one. Bill Burroughs of St. Louis, a rather wealthy background, IBM yourself, led you not simply to writing, but to that area, to that North African, quote-unquote, exotic area, away from what could be a much more conventional life.
Well, the conventional life was actually not all that available to me. I graduated from Harvard during the Depression, and when a Harvard degree meant very little. And while my grandfather was the inventor of the adding machine, my family got almost nothing out of it. So we could never have been described as wealthy. And by the time I went to North Africa, I'd already written this book, Junkie, and had the experiences that are described in there. And I was more or less, should we say, committed to writing. And I had read Paul Bowles' books about Tangier, and it sounded like a very fascinating place, and I must say it fully lived up to expectations.
The money wasn't there. That was Burroughs in whichever city he lived in. I mean, he lived in London for many years. He was known as l'ombre invisible, the invisible man. He liked to go to places and live very discreetly, almost in isolation, right? And just to be an observer, not to interact.
Yeah, but if not, he won't be William Burroughs, because that's why people like him also, according to Mohammed Shukri, because Mohammed Shukri, he wrote 2 biographies about poor boys and Tennessee Williams, their times in Tangier. Mohammed Shukri was admiring William Burroughs, actually, because he said that he never liked the Western perspective on the people on Tangier itself. He was kind of against these Orientalist ideas. Western artists from romanticized and exotic notions onto the city, and viewing it as a playground for their creative and personal liberation. For him, maybe it was also the case. He was also different. Maybe that's why he was interested in this thin line between reality and dream.
And of course, Naked Lunch, which he writes when he's there, he's got plenty of access to heroin, so he can basically shoot up and write. I think it's Burroughs who comes up with the word Interzone. It was Tangier International Zone, wasn't it? And he christens it the Interzone, as we've been talking about, as this completely unique space where all these different things are interacting.
Exactly, the things in between. So that's why he didn't want to belong to neither the French side or to the locals. He was always like in between. And also it's a kind of a space for him and to create something more universal in Naked Lunch.
Naked Lunch, probably of all his works, is the one that's lasted the longest, isn't it? And whilst he's there, Ginsberg and Kerouac came in the late 50s, partly actually to help him organise his writing so they could actually publish it, wasn't it? I think Kerouac, who'd been sort of a bit sceptical of Burroughs' writing, was really affected, when he read the manuscript of Naked Lunch. And I think it was Ginsberg who, played a crucial role, as he did with many of his friends, actually, in promoting it and getting it actually published.
Look at Jack Kerouac, for instance. It's he said it himself. His poetry was never the same after he came to Tangier.
For Ginsberg too, I think Ginsberg's transformation from a beat to a hippie, Tangier is crucial in that, right?
That's true.
Here is Allen Ginsberg and Burroughs talking about Tangier.
Kerouac came, we're now talking about 1957 again, in Tangier.
In Tangier, yeah.
Kerouac preceded myself and Orlovsky to Tangier to meet Bill, with the intention that we all had of working on the manuscript. And I was bringing along all of the correspondence that Bill had sent me, which had pieces of Naked Lunch in it. So what material did Jack begin with?
I don't recall. I think he started with the straight narrative sections.
Yeah.
The ones that were the most accessible and publishable, like the beginning and the vigilante, and those sort of pieces.
What kind of relation did you have with Jack then?
Oh, well,
you were alone there for a while.
Yeah, he was sort of paranoid about Tangiers in Europe. He didn't like anything outside of America, really. Mm-hmm. He didn't like it, and he didn't like the Arabs, and he thought the place was dirty, and it was an American reaction.
Jack told me a story about you getting very drunk and maudlin and wanting to make it with him then.
Well, I don't remember. I don't remember anything of sorts. I often don't remember things. Mercifully,
he was kind of flattered. It was the one and only time, because there was something between you that was non-sexual, that always interested.
Well, I should hope there would be something between somebody that is not eroticized, my dear, for God's sakes.
Actually interacting with local artists, some of the people that you've mentioned, maybe in a less way with the other locals. I was just thinking when you were speaking, I've myself done a lot of work in Russia before the war as a research into forbidden music in the Cold War era. What I realized is that sometimes a stranger, an outsider coming to a culture can see things which are not apparent to the locals, or not valued necessarily by the locals. I mean, you find this in Germany, is that you come to Germany as an outsider, and maybe you see things in Cologne or in Berlin or in German culture, because you've got a fresh eyes, you are an outsider, so you can somehow have a different creative response than somebody who's embedded there.
It's very true, and at the same time, you also discover yourself, and you also discover your own culture. It was always like that. The thing about Tangier also, the more I dig into the subject, the more I don't know nothing. Really strange, and that's the mysterious part of it. But that's the beautiful thing about it as well. What's also interesting, as a Moroccan, I also try to include the forgotten voices also. I try to create a kind of discussion.
You said something then which really struck me, which is that I was talking about the fact that an expat, somebody who's an outsider, can see things which maybe locals who are embedded can't. But also when we go to other places, we find out who we are. Sometimes it's easier to find out about oneself or to maybe even develop as a person outside a context which you're familiar with. So for an American landing in Tangier in 1940s, 1950s, it was probably that place that allowed those people to flourish in that way, because they could either become more who they are or at least discover who they could be.
Because if you look at the writings of William Burroughs before they came to Tangier, it's it's different than after they came to Tangier. If you read Interzone, the short stories Interzone from William Burroughs, or even his Naked Lunch, it's because of the influence of Tangier, the place, and also the people around him, even though most of them didn't recognize that maybe the city or the people influenced their work. So that's why I wanted to dive into this concept, Tangier Interzone, and try to search for the Moroccans.
Classic era of the Interzone came to an end in 1956. What actually happened then in terms of Morocco's social politics?
Morocco gained its independence, and some of the Western, artists or writers, or you were scared, you were afraid that Tangier will lose its mythical, I think it continues even after the independence. Poor boys, he stayed, but still he was scared all his life.
What was he scared of?
Well, he was scared that his Tangier, will change. He always wanted that a still image of Tangier and the culture, stays like it used to be. That's a kind of a nightmare to deal with, especially if you don't let your ego go as an artist or writer, and you want to stay in the place, but also you don't want to accept the dynamic of a social fabric and create a problem to some.
We become attached to our particular vision or myth of a place.
Yes.
And we sort of mourn the fact that it's changed or it's changing, even though that change, apart from being organic, is actually maybe for the best for all the people who live there. But actually, a romantic ideal of it is threatened. And so for Bowles, I suppose he'd created a very strong romantic ideal about Tangier. Society and politics moved on. Tangier was still a place where smugglers would go and black marketeers, but I guess as Moroccan independence came, then the legal structures of the place became more consistent.
Things came step by step. Still, it's Morocco. There's a lot of freedoms. You live your life. If you are like Paul Boys, as you said, he was wealthy and he was like in a comfort zone, and he can still do whatever he wants.
And you said that Tangier Interzone was more than a geographical anomaly. It was a psychological, cultural state of being and a laboratory for artistic and intellectual experimentation. That has continued, hasn't it? So maybe it's actually the Moroccans themselves, like people like you are, who are actually continuing that tradition.
It's still a place really still fascinating, and it's always transforming. There is always something new. Tangier as a city, as a physical space, it's very inspiring, and also the Moroccan writers and artists also they have a big influence on my work. The inspiration, it's more wide now. You can find it in music, in cinema, and the Interzone or the Beat Generation or Tangier itself or Morocco. Or I'm still searching, and I'm getting inspired every day. I created a whole kind of reality around the subject. Maybe that is not true. It's like William Burroughs. It's always this space between dream and reality.
Aziz, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Oh, thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Thanks very much to Aziz. I'm going to put links to his work and to the Arab Media Project in the show notes. It's absolutely fascinating if you want to take a deeper dive. It's interesting, isn't it? Tangier still, to me, conjures up a kind of mysterious, exotic vision. I mean, maybe you've got places that you have heard about, maybe never been to, that already exist in the imagination. I'm sure people have it about London. I mean, there's the city and there's the myth of the city. Both can be wonderful or terrible in different ways. Both are important and perhaps true, though not and never the whole truth. And of course, both are changing, as is taught about the desire of Burroughs and others to freeze Tangier in time, or at least their version of Tangier. I mean, we talk about going to exotic places before they became spoiled, we proudly say, meaning before tourists like us turned up. For the locals, it's often the opposite of being spoiled. Well, thanks for listening. Come on another journey with us next time on the Bureau of Lost Culture. Check us out, bureauoflostculture.com. Drop us a line if you like. And I will see you further down the road, round the bend, over the hillsides, for more tales from the underground and the counterculture. Let's finish with some more words from Paul Bowles.
For a long time, I've had this particular nightmare, that of seeing my luggage go off on the train, remaining on the platform. But I think how much worse it would be if my body were on the train and my luggage on the platform, the train started up, and I wouldn't be able to stay behind in Tangier, because I want to stay here. My determination is to stay where I am, that is to say, in Morocco.
سبيا ذكر مولانا سبيا